Welcome.
Thanks, Rox. Really glad to see you.
Nice to see you too. So the engagement. You worked on this book for 10 years, right? So when you started writing the book, you started before the Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage nationwide. So what was your intent when you started, and how did that change when that happened?
Yeah, so I first had the germ of the idea for this book in the summer of 2011. And what had happened, at that point, just to sort of take you back, I think that sort of triggered this for me in part was watching the New York State Senate vote to pass a marriage equality bill. It got signed into law by Governor Cuomo, whom you may have heard of. New York was only the 6th or 7th state, I think, to legalize same-sex marriage, but it was the first large state to do it through the political process instead of having it initiated by the courts. And the way that the dynamics sort of played out in New York sort of convinced me, as somebody who had covered politics for a while, but had never written about this issue in particular, that the dynamics of this had really shifted, and that, enough Republicans felt safe voting for this. Conservative Democrats did too. There was enough Republican money that was sort of backing. And I thought what I was struck by then was it was the first time that I felt like I finally knew how this was going to end. I think, Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage in 2004. There's a real question, would this just be a one-state experiment for a long time? There's a real fear that political backlash in Massachusetts could undo the court victory there, and we might be looking back at this the way we look at Reconstruction or something, which is like this brief flowering of new rights and liberties that got sort of wiped away by backlash. And that was a moment I sort of felt the tide turn. And so when I started working on this book in 2012, there was no expectation of a Supreme Court case. Barack Obama announcing that he had changed his position on this issue was the thing that sort of made me think that the time had right to begin this. And I thought it was going to be about the country sort of not the path to this becoming the law of the land in 50 states, but the path to the country reaching consensus on what had been, the most divisive sort of social cultural issue of my lifetime. And then obviously what happened was that there was a whole lot more progress in the time I was working on it.
And so did that change how you did the book?
It certainly changed the scope of the book, right?
It has an ending, which is nice.
It has an ending, and it has a real sense of finality. And that's in part because it ends at the Supreme Court. And there was also relatively little backlash or fallout from the decision in 2015. And there's just sort of things in the writing that you have to do, like, this is the sort of nature of marriage as it's fought out as 50 statewide things, political legal fights, and then the Supreme Court sort of gets a hold of pieces of it. But they're things that because they become the questions that the Supreme Court is reckoning with, you then all of a sudden you look back and you're like, oh, that, how Ohio passed its marriage ban in 2004 becomes a more central part of the story, because that ends up being the thing that comes before the justices in 2015.
Yeah, so let me take you back to the beginning of this whole fight. One of the things that struck me from the book is actually right in the beginning, where you talk about how the 1990s, post-Cold War, pre-war on terror, there was a room in our sort of political and sort of social landscape for both religious conservatives and sort of activists, social activists, to come to the fore of American politics. How did that inform the fight for gay marriage?
Yeah, so our politics were pretty low stakes in the 90s. It's probably some part of the reason why Bill Clinton's sex life became the dominant issue in our national politics for a couple of years. Part of the reason that we had a lot of like really small bore things like, midnight basketball and, school uniforms being the things that presidential campaigns were fought over. And, as I suggested, I think the end of the Cold War really ended the big foreign policy, national security debates before 9/11, represented them. And there was, something approaching consensus around the big economic questions about the role of government and such. And I think that just created a void in which basically as a country we needed things to fight over. And there was an opportunity for a lot of social and cultural issues to emerge, and some of them were sort of silly and frittered away, should we teach Ebonics in school, which we fought over for a while as a country, or pretended to fight over as a country, and that turned out not to be a salient one. And this one turned into a major civil rights revolution. And what had happened in starting in the late 70s and 80s was these two movements rose in parallel. The sort of gay rights movement, people sort of trace the origin of the modern gay rights movement to Stonewall. It wasn't really until the late 70s that gay rights advocacy became professionalized and formalized, and not until the 80s it had real funding and a foothold in Washington. And by the 90s, the gay rights movement was, especially getting out from under the sort of urgent reactive demands of the AIDS crisis, in a position to sort of assert itself politically. And almost exactly contemporaneously, the religious right, the primarily evangelical Protestant right, but also in coordination at times with Catholics and Mormons and some fundamentalist Protestants, were ascendant too. And they end up having this ultimately symbiotic relationship, which is like they are almost built for conflict with one another, and this becomes the thing that they end up going to war over in the mid-90s.
Well, and in fact, tell us a little bit about how the fight for gay marriage is really in large part a result of conservatives trying to stop gay marriage, right? It wasn't even something that came up as much in the gay community to begin with.
Yeah, so the book starts in 1990, and I tell the story of this sort of peculiar local conflict in Honolulu that basically sprawls out of control. And it ends with this surprise decision before the Hawaii Supreme Court in May of 1993. It becomes the first court on earth to rule in favor of same-sex marriage rights. And the first institution of any real consequence on the mainland to really notice, one thing you realize as you go back and sort of unearth this press coverage is like, we just don't pay enough attention to stuff that happens in Hawaii and probably Alaska. If this had been basically any one of 48 other states ruling, I think it wouldn't have taken so long. But the first mainland institution to really understand the gravity of this court decision is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I sort of reconstruct how the Mormon church leadership, they had a sort of historic presence in Hawaii dating back to missionary work in the Pacific in the 19th century. And they, set out, they think of this as a real threat to their values. And they sort of set out almost like this three-pronged reaction. One is they get the Utah State Legislature to draft a bill, which ultimately close to 40 states end up adopting their own versions of, that says that Utah's not going to recognize gay marriages from another state. The next thing they do is they create basically a front organization in Hawaii to ultimately pass a constitutional amendment to the Hawaii state constitution that will take this out of the hands of the Hawaii courts before they can marry folks. And they do this. Mormons are well aware that they're incredibly savvy about politics, and they I think are dating back to, they're very aware dating back to the 19th century of how kind of mainstream American popular opinion views them, and are aware that it would often be counterproductive to their political goals if they were seen as the face of their political activity. And so they create this front operation in Honolulu where basically in partnership with the archdiocese there, the Catholics are the spokespeople for this, but it's Mormon money, Mormon expertise lobbying the legislature to ultimately move this to the ballot and then pass it. And then the other thing they do is they start building a network with other conservative religious denominations and activists on the mainland. And that leads to the Defense of Marriage Act being passed in 1996, which says that the federal government will not recognize anything other than heterosexual marriages under federal law. So where the story starts in 1990, by that point there is not a gay rights organization in the United States that has endorsed marriage rights as an objective. There is barely a politician in the United States that has ever been asked his or her opinion on this. It did not exist as a political issue in the way we think of a political issue, and had the Mormons not first latched onto this when they did and basically made it a big national issue, it would have continued as a sort of matter for the Hawaii courts, and that would have progressed at its own pace. It would not necessarily have become something that other state legislatures dealt with in the way they did, and eventually they came, and so within 6 years, the book starts in 1990, and there's not a politician in America who's been asked about it, and then 5 years later, 6 years later, it's on the desk of Bill Clinton, having to decide, should we pass a federal law to deal with what had been this very local issue in Hawaii.
And so that then prompts, that does prompt a coalescing of a movement, right? So part of what seems to be unique, I think you've talked about this, with this particular civil rights fight, is that there was a very distinct goal, right? And so being told that they couldn't marry then prompted a movement to demand marriage.
Yeah, I mean, it was as much just to fight back. I mean, so, there'd been this sort of active divide within the gay and lesbian community. And just to be clear, not using all the letters in the umbrella phrase, because there were a lot of bisexuals and transgender people who were able to marry the person they loved throughout this time, regardless of what the laws in their state were. There's a pretty active debate at a sort of very abstract level in the 1980s about whether marriage was worth fighting for. There was, again, no organization that had endorsed this or even thought about it. There's not an active court case anywhere in the United States, but there was sort of lawyers, legal theorists, academics who were arguing, is marriage worth fighting for? And some of this was a strategic debate. We have other priorities as a movement that are sort of more incremental, accessible gains, having non-discrimination, equal protection language written into local or state statutes, getting sexual orientation covered under hate crimes laws, funding for recognition for HIV/AIDS, right? A whole bundle of things, fighting back to opponents who are trying to ban gays and lesbians from being school teachers. So there's some people who are just like, we have real things in front of us that we can actually win. Why are we doing this big reach that's going to potentially antagonize people? But there was also sort of ideological debate, and in the wake of Stonewall, what sort of the flowering of the gay liberation movement was informed in large part by a sense that gays and lesbians were asserting their own sexual values and mores that were apart from, if not in opposition to, sort of mainstream, heteronormative American society. And so there were a lot of gays and lesbians who said, why would we aspire to be part of the kind of middle class, white picket fence relationships of our parents? The whole point of developing our own community is to break free of that and define relationships on our own fresh terms. And then you had another critique that was, distinct from that, mostly articulated by women. To the extent there was LGBT family law in the 1980s, it was female lawyers representing female clients who were almost always women who had been in heterosexual marriages, had a child, come out, left their husband, and then had to go to court to fight for the right to their own children. And the lawyers who represented these clients were, people who had gone to college and law school in the 60s, 70s, been shaped by sort of second wave feminist thinking about marriage, and they saw it as this, fundamentally patriarchal institution that existed to, subjugate women. And from their perspective, they were thinking as much as feminists as they were as lesbians, and it's why would we as women be fighting for inclusion in this institution that's counter to our goals? And they said that the goal of the gay rights movement should be, often they talked about multiple families, a legal regime where a broad spectrum of relationships are treated equally under the law, single parent households, co-parent adoption, unmarried couples, multi-member households, whatever, but not have marriages kind of treated as the only way that people can register their interdependence with the state, right? And so that was an active sort of theoretical debate in the 1980s. By 1990,
that seems a harder sell.
It would have been a harder sell as a legal change, I think, certainly. But this all felt so abstract in the late 80s, just getting a family court judge to let a woman have access to her own biological child in an individual case in many parts of the country was a hard sell. So like this was being fought out in, it was like the same level of abstraction as like people are like, should we ban meat consumption? It's like, it's an interesting conversation, but it's not happening anytime soon, right? And so, but 1996 rolls around and it becomes clear that the top priority of the religious right in the United States is stopping gay people from marrying. And all of a sudden, I quote Paula Edelbrick, who'd been a lesbian attorney at Lambda Legal, who'd been the sort of most articulate, loudest voice on the sort of feminist critique of marriage. And she's like, well, the whole world is blowing up over our relationships. Our opponents are, fighting tooth and nail to stop us. Of course, I need to fight to defend this right. And it's the opponents that brought some sense of unanimity. It was still not a priority for everybody, though, right? But there was a sense that we can't let our opponents have this big victory unchallenged.
So one of the things that's interesting, and we touch on this in the beginning of this conversation. If you don't know, the spoiler at the end of the book is that the Supreme Court legalizes marriage in all 50 states in America, or makes it legal. But here's what's interesting about that, and you touch on this where you said that was, for the most part, the end of the story, in that the Supreme Court has been the decider on a lot of divisive social issues, right? Abortion, voting rights, even Obamacare. Those fights continue sometimes for decades. I mean, like the most divisive issues in America for decades. Why is this different? Why did this just? Why is it just the way it is?
Yeah, and so I expected, and so sort of gets back to the process question you asked early on, in sort of mapping out my timetable for the book. I had, sort of understanding with my editors. Once it became clear this was going to get resolved at the Supreme Court during the time when I could be working on this book, was like, let's wait until we get an ending to this thing. And it was like, for me, it was not just wait till the court decision comes down, but I expected that there would be, years of sort of active backlash to this. And the way I envisioned it, I thought I would be, hopscotching around like county courthouses in various red states as local officials were, standing in doorways, or, people were barricading gay couples from going in and getting licenses. In the end, there was one, that woman, Kim Davis in Kentucky, who went to jail. But the fact that we all know her name is a sign of how small that resistance was. But my anticipation, and that was from overlearning, I think, reading too much about Brown v. Board or Roe v. Wade, which each instigated provoked a backlash in different forms. So I think a few reasons for this. One, and this was true in states that legalized marriage, and then when the federal government struck down state bans and effectively imposed this, is the for you have this landmark court decision, or these landmark court decisions in states that dramatically extend a new set of rights to a category of people who'd been excluded, and everybody recognizes the momentousness of them. But the implementation of this was like shockingly easy everywhere, which is like, there's a court order, and guess what? County clerks now have to sometimes rewrite the words on a form, on a one-page form that says, so instead of saying husband and wife, or it says partner one, partner two, or like spouse / whatever. And somewhere at the registrar of public records, somebody has to create a new spreadsheet on a form to measure, a new line on a spreadsheet to measure different types of couplings. But like, this is really easy. The Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that public schools had to be desegregated, and we're now 70 years later, and we don't know actually how to desegregate neighborhood public schools. And a lot of the backlash was to Brown and to affirmative action decisions and to a whole bunch of things that the court has ruled on, came from the fact that people's lives were disrupted when this court order came down, and that the local politics of figuring out how to actually do this on the ground is really tough. And this was really easy, and nobody's other than the people who are now able to marry and their family and their children, but the opposition didn't see their lives affected in any way. That's a huge difference. A few other small things, one, opponents recognized before the Obergefell decision in 2015 that they had lost. And that was not necessarily the case. And so if you remember that day in June 2015, it was momentous and major news, but I don't think you were shocked because you had been conditioned through media coverage to expect this as the outcome. And the court had been sending signals through the cases that they did not take over the previous year, the appeals they did not take, that this is how they would end up. And so during that time, opponents of same-sex marriage pivoted to two different areas. One, they went to sort of trans issues or issues related to gender identity, where public opinion was much more favorable to them. And so a lot of the kind of political infrastructure and capital and money that had been fighting gay marriage now has been for the last 5 or 6 years fighting, these bathroom bills or the girls' sports issues. And then the other thing is they pivoted quickly to sort of the religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions, which, so you've had a couple of cases go to the Supreme Court that are in their way about marriage. You had the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which was the baker in Colorado who didn't want to bake a custom cake to celebrate the wedding of two men. He said it violated his biblical values. And then there was the case from Philadelphia, the Fulton case, which was a Catholic social service agency with a contract with the city of Philadelphia that did not want to place children with same-sex foster families. And these are obviously both related to marriage, but what is really important, and we're going to see, this is the beginning, I think, of a very long arc of conservatives testing how far the court will carve out religious exemptions related to kind of issues of sex and gender, but it's important to see how different this is, which is like, this is fundamentally a loser's game. It is saying we have given up trying to change the laws to reflect biblical values, which was the sort of message of religious conservatism for 30, 40 years. There's a reason that Jerry Falwell called his group the moral majority. The argument was this is a majority Christian or Judeo-Christian country, and the laws should reflect biblical values. Now, the argument is, you hear from religious conservatives, you could be home, if you turned off this live stream and turned on Fox right now, you wouldn't have to wait more than 5 minutes. You hear somebody say, we Christians are the besieged minority in this country. We're under siege from the courts and big tech and academia and Hollywood and whatever, woke capital, whatever that is. And we need the protection of the courts because we're a minority that cannot get our way through the political process. And so they just sort of turned. And then the other big part of it is Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president 11 days before the Supreme Court decision in the June of 2015. The two things we'll see in history books that happened that month that are momentous. And if you had told me in advance that the sort of most talented demagogue of modern American history would announce his candidacy for president the same month that we have a sort of sweeping civil rights ruling from the Supreme Court that struck down the laws of red states and whatever, I would have assumed that those things would have been related in some potentially explosive ways. And the fact is that for all of his instinct and gift for pitting people against one another on identity lines, he's not terribly judgmental about who you have sex with and who you're married to. And some part of the story of this is that if Donald Trump had decided to make his campaign during the primaries and the general election about ringleading conservative reaction to the Supreme Court decision, people like Ted Cruz and would have followed, and I think that we would have spent a lot more of that election year focusing on the Supreme Court decision. But he didn't. He wanted to pick on immigrants and Muslims and Mexicans and whatever, and so it kind of just disappeared as an issue.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating, actually. But plus there was. What you talk about towards the end of this fight is that people no longer wanted to have their name attached to being anti-gay marriage. At some point that shifted. Was there something in particular that shifted it? Was it just sort of seeing the way the wind was blowing?
So there's a big shift in money that kind of goes in parallel with elite opinion. And so I told the story of this guy, Fred Karger, who was a retired Republican political operative. He'd worked for Ronald Reagan, openly gay guy in Southern California. And when Proposition 8, which is an effort to ban same-sex marriage through the California Constitution, qualifies for the ballot in 2008, Karger decides that his contribution to this effort is going to be to launch boycotts of, big donors to the pro-Prop 8 side. And boycotts are not a new tactic in American life, but they used to require a whole lot of coordination to get a big consumer boycott going. You needed media attention. You needed to, disseminate knowledge of which products or services the business that is owned by the person that you're trying to boycott or run by. And these things happen, but they were tough. The internet changed that dramatically. And so he was able to, go online, download a list of everybody who had given money from the California Campaign Finance Board website, take everybody who gave over $500, he gave that list to a friend of his who was a coder who overlaid it on a Google map, and they had this, Prop 8 hate map or something that all of a sudden you could go look up which neighbor of yours had given money. And he launched boycotts of big public-facing targets. The biggest one was this guy, Doug Manchester, who is a major developer in San Diego. There's a big Grand Hyatt downtown that's attached to the convention center, and they started boycotting it. And all of a sudden, I think some consumer travel dropped off, but big conventions and groups started. The American Psychological Association said we're not staying there, unions, stuff like that. And the guy ended up selling the hotel 2 years later. And it basically set off a wave of similar boycotts. And one thing you see from, up until 2008 or through 2008, almost everywhere that the gay marriage had been on the ballot, the anti-gay marriage side had more resources than the pro-gay marriage side. And by 2012, it's up in 4 states. For the first time, the pro-gay marriage side sweeps all of those ballot measures. And some part of that is that the financial advantage has now shifted. And some of that is that there were new donors who were coming in to give money to the pro-gay marriage side, not just historically gay donors, but Mike Bloomberg and Brad Pitt and Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Bezos, Scott, I don't know what we're supposed to call her, Scott, gave $2.5 million, was one of the largest single political donations in American history at that time. So there was new money coming in. It was a safe thing for just sort of center lefty donors to give to, which was not the case a decade earlier, but also a lot of the big money that had been going to fund anti-gay advocacy just walked away from it. And some part of that, I think, is the story of how this just became in business circles and sort of elite opinion, a sort of unacceptable position to have. There was a controversy at Mozilla in 2013, I believe. A guy named Brandon Ike, who had been the CTO of Mozilla, had given $1,000 to the Prop 8 campaign in 2008. Probably was endorsed by John McCain. This was a mainstream position in 2008. His appointment to become CEO of Mozilla gets squashed because people start resigning from the board in protest. There's a boycott launched, and it has gone in 5 years from this is a totally mainstream cause that you can give money to, just like you would give money to, anything, to this is like you are a member of the Ku Klux Klan, you cannot be involved in polite society anymore. And that shift dramatically changes how politicians, donors, activists sort of see their place in this debate.
So I found this book, even though, again, I knew what happened at the end, I found it really hopeful, right? And you tell all of these disparate stories, and you have the people you root for, and as you see them start to win, you feel swept up in that. And so I found it really hopeful, right? And so for those of us who care about the sort of arc of justice, it feels like it feels like you want there to be a roadmap, right? Like, this worked for this issue. How do you make it work for other issues? And I'm struck by this idea of the boycott actually working and making people not be able to be associated with ideas, because I don't feel like that works anymore, or it doesn't work on other issues. But I guess, the question is, what are the lessons that that this movement has for other civil rights movements?
So I think on the boycott question, so we now have this debate about cancel culture, which is not a phrase I find particularly useful because I don't actually know what it means anymore, but we tend to discuss or debate it about the propriety of it as a tactic. Is it in a liberal society, should people be shamed for having opinions, or there's a good debate to have there. We do not talk enough about its effectiveness as a tactic. And I think this is an example of how it can become effective. And so I think there may be things, and I think often boycott campaigns or online shaming campaigns, even if they're not expressly about driving business away from somebody, are about expressing moral disapproval and not used as a tactic in a broader strategy to change the sort of economic and political dynamics around an issue. And so, Fred Karger was not in this to shame Doug Manchester so that he could feel morally superior to him. I mean, he enjoyed this. It was gleeful, these were fun protests, but he had a sense of this was part of a bigger strategy. And then, after Prop 8 wins, he goes and does this to other people around the country. And it's not just because we want to show Betsy, the DeVos Prince family, that they're bad people. And so that's why we're going to tell people not to go to Orlando Magic games. It is because we think that if we can make them not want to give money anymore, that's $3 million that they had given to anti-gay marriage campaigns in 2004 that won't be given. And you know what? You can go out and if you want to have a $3 million fundraising advantage over your opponents, you go out and raise $3 million. Or you could try to get the other side's donors to keep $3 million in their wallets, or give it to, the Friends of Rittenhouse Square or whatever. And so I think sometimes it's that people are not approaching boycotts in a strategic context, and that's why they might not be effective, more than this is not necessarily a tactic that works now. I think the big message, which it might be inspiring more than it's useful, is that no part of this was inevitable, right? And so it wasn't inevitable that this would come before the Supreme Court in 2015 and that the court would rule the way they did. I tell a story of a strategy meeting in 2005 in Jersey City where representatives of all of the major sort of LGBT political and legal groups come together to plot a national strategy. Some donors have put up money and they say, we're willing to back stuff, but we need to see a vision for how this is supposed to work. And they lay out what they acknowledge as a very optimistic plan for how you can win before the Supreme Court in 2025. So just the timing of that and the arc of that were not inevitable. But to go back to that story from the 1990s, it was not inevitable that this would be the issue that gay rights activists and big donors would get behind. It was not inevitable that this would be the issue that religious conservatives would elevate in the way they did. It was not inevitable that this was going to become, I think, the sort of defining social cultural debate of most of our lifetimes. And for people who care about social change, I think the lesson in that is this is something that goes from nowhere in our politics to before the Supreme Court with a national resolution with them saying that there's a fundamental right to this in the U.S. Constitution, right? And I think the lesson in that should be for people who care about social change is that the issues that are in front of us, that are in front of our legislators or our politicians, the issues that we're reading about, that are being argued about in the media today, the questions that are before our courts today do not have to be the questions that we are talking about 5 or 10 years from now. There's a remarkable ability to change the issues that are in front of us and the choices that political and legal systems have. And, some part of this is not a useful roadmap because there's stuff that happened by accident and serendipity and not things that you can easily sort of reverse engineer for any cause. But I think that, some of this was just pushing the bounds of our political imagination. And I think part of the story is that, issues can come out of basically nowhere and all of a sudden, have a critical mass in a shockingly condensed period of time, right? It might have been crazy in the early 19th century to say women should be guaranteed the vote by the U.S. Constitution, but that was a 75-year arc from Seneca Falls to an amendment. This was happening in 25 years, and I think that should be inspiring to people who want to bring new issues into a conversation.
Interesting. I have a couple more questions for Sasha, but if anybody has questions, there are some microphones. I think T is getting up to get a microphone. Please raise your hands if you have any questions. Oh, there are some questions. Okay. T will take.
Oh, thank you. So hello, my name is Quinn. I'm a student at the Haverford School, and it was really inspiring to see how you described that there's this end that people perceive in the movement for gay rights. Ever since from Stonewall, that progressive action has gone to this kind of like final ending with the passing of gay marriage and legalization. Do you think that, people have become too complacent with, how things are in society, and especially with the youth and how they perceive as rainbow capitalism and how corporations are profiting off of LGBTQ people? Do you think that the movement has been complacent?
So I think some of it's like, what's the definition of the movement? Not to, fly spec your answer too much. I think that the movement is a broad coalition. I talked a little bit about the differences between how gay men and lesbian women in the 1980s saw marriage, and they are, gay men and lesbian women were in a coalition then, and sometimes they had the same interests and priorities, and sometimes they had a very different set of concerns, right? I was talking about the adoption issue. There weren't a lot of men in the 1980s who were accidentally giving birth to children that they then had to go to court for, right? And so, but gay men and lesbians ended up in a political coalition together to fight for shared priorities. Bisexuals, transgender people, other people with non-conforming gender identities are in a coalition together, and different parts of the coalition have had different degrees of progress on their issue. I think that, people who are concerned with issues of gender identity would feel like they have made far less progress than folks who are dealing with issues related to sexual orientation. And on the sexual orientation front, it's still, I forget the number now, 12, 13 states that do not forbid, do not protect sexual orientation, let alone gender identity as a protected class for employment, housing, lending discrimination. So there are, a fair number of states where you can still be denied a mortgage, or somebody can decide not to rent their house to you and don't have to come up with a elaborate cover story for why. They can just say because you're gay. There's still some pretty fundamental work, and those were the same questions that 40 years ago people would have said, like, we'll get this first, and then if we do marriage, we'll do marriage later on. So some of it is just this weird flipping of the sequence. I think in terms of like broad cultural acceptance, though, there has been major progress, and marriage was, Zach sort of pointed at this debate in his introduction about whether winning marriage before you get some of those really basic material protections was the right order, or whether it was counterproductive. And there's an argument that's made that I think is pretty persuasive that the marriage debate, because it was sort of so accessible, it was not about a kind of technical question about equal protection doctrine. It was about this, very basic question about, as the bumper sticker goes, like, whether love is love, or that it helped usher along greater social acceptance in a way that if the battle had been fought over a kind of more technical legal question, wouldn't have been the case. But I think it's like unquestionable that the LGBT movement writ large has a lot of work to do at the state level, local level in certain places, federal level. Part of the complacency might be that different parts of that coalition feel like the important work that is relevant to them is done. I think some of that is a challenge for how that coalition holds together going forward.
I have a question in the back from a virtual viewer. I also saw some other hands go up in the audience, so we'll definitely come to you. Not going to skip over you. From our virtual viewer, we have, what helped you decide that now was the right time to release this book?
So some of it was out of my hands, so it took a while to finish it, number one.
10 years.
So the initial plan had been that it would come out last June of 2020, which would have
9 years.
Yes, would have been 9 years. Which would have had the benefit of being the 5th anniversary of the Obergefell decision before the Supreme Court that we were talking about, and COVID delayed publication 3 times over the course of 2020, and then the idea was to put it out in June because that is Pride Month. But the sort of short answer was it's out more or less as quickly as I was able to get it done.
And the target date was 5-year anniversary, which
that was
nice.
The initial hope, yeah.
Other questions? Elliot has a question.
I'm sure in the book you write about the day that Biden sort of spoke out of turn on this issue, forcing Obama to reassess his position. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. So the story starts, basically the previous summer, when Obama tells this is summer 2011 now, tells his sort of close circle that he basically wants to find a way to get to changing his position, his political position on marriage, and tasks, sort of David Plouffe, Jim Messina, Dan Pfeiffer, Valerie Jarrett to some degree, with coming up with a way to do this. And the thing that provokes it is he, people around him basically say they think he was somewhere between uncomfortable and disingenuous in his previous position, that he opposed gay marriage and supported civil unions. That was his position when he ran statewide in Illinois in 2004 and then for president in 2008. The thing that really triggered this desire to reverse was that he went to New York in the summer of 2011 for had a couple of fundraisers in Manhattan, one of which was an LGBT themed fundraiser for the DNC that included a performance of Sister Act 2 on Broadway. And Andrew Cuomo was being celebrated for having just signed a bill into law to legalize same-sex marriage. And I quote an Obama advisor saying he felt like the skunk at the garden party, I think was the line, where, basically the kind of what he thought of as his liberal base, and then he got heckled at this fundraiser about his position on marriage, and was being seen by his own party as a laggard on this now, and Cuomo celebrated as the kind of pioneer, and so there were these deliberations over the course of late 2011 and early 2012 about how exactly you do this, right? And if you're, there was an understanding he had to come out and explain this. You cannot just reverse it. You're the president of the United States. This has been a contentious issue. So then the question is, how do you explain it? There was some talk about giving a speech along the lines of the race speech that he gave at the Constitution Center in 2008, where, in a very Obama-ish professorial way, he would sort of lay out his thinking. There was a fear that if you do that, you draw more attention to it than it merits. And then there's the kind of question and so they came up with the idea that he would do it in a news interview. There was research that suggested it was better to do it with a female interviewer. They made plans to have it when he was in New York, so he could do it on the set of The View. I'm not sure there's marriage that shows that 4 female interviewers are more effective than 1, but so that was sort of thought of as the optimal setting for him to do this. And then the question was the timing, and there was a desire to so we're now looking into 2012. They want the election against Mitt Romney to be about the economy and private equity, and Mitt Romney's a dangerous plutocrat, not about did Barack Obama flip-flop on gay marriage. They thought that there was net upside to them with what they would get from donors and volunteer activity and sort of the activity of their base, but they wanted to do it early enough that this would not dominate the conventions or the debates or become a focal point in the election. So the plan was that he was going to go to New York for fundraisers in June of 2012, and that they would get him on The View then, and he would do it. And Biden was vaguely, was aware of the general contours of this conversation, but my understanding is not necessarily the particulars of it. Biden gets asked on Meet the Press in May of 2012. He gives an answer that if you go back and you look at it on paper and try to diagram the sentence, it's not entirely clear what he either was saying or thought he was saying. But he tapes it on a Friday afternoon. Biden's comms team flags it for the campaign in Chicago and says, they basically realize that this is going to look like, regardless of what the intent was, this is going to look like a deviation from what the White House's position on this was. It airs on Sunday. Jay Carney gets asked about it at the White House press conference in like 41 different ways at the briefing on Monday, and they do not have a good answer as to, they're trying to insist that Biden has not said anything different than Obama has said before. It is a very unsatisfying and unconvincing answer. Other cabinet secretaries start getting asked about this, and it becomes clear in the White House within 36 hours this is unsustainable. And so Wednesday morning, they basically decide that they can't wait another month until they sort of, do this the way that they'd hoped to set it up on The View. And they invite Robin Roberts from ABC down, and Obama, says what he would have said a month later otherwise. But it, so, the sort of the net of that story, some of the folklore is that Biden pushed Obama to do something he wasn't going to do. That is not true. What is true is that Biden dramatically changed the circumstances under which Obama did something that the White House was already planning to do. And some part of Biden's comfort saying what he was saying was probably informed by the fact that he knew that this was the place where the president was heading.
Part of what's amazing is, given where we are, that when you lay out that story and they decided that Obama had decided he was going to announce his support of gay marriage, but they were like all that hand wringing over when the right time would be and what issues they had to get through and like all of that. And then he announces it and it's not that big a deal. Yeah.
I mean, Romney gets asked about it a few hours later. He's like, I disagree with him, but I don't think that's what this election should be about. They raised more money that day than they'd raised any other day on the campaign. There was no evidence. Amazingly, I think I mentioned in the book, the stories the day after the election, and the lead story in the New York Times and the Washington Post don't mention this thing that had happened 6 months earlier as a part of the kind of central narrative of what had happened in this campaign. It just sort of, disappears. And what it ends up doing that has a real practical, the fact is that it's sort of irrelevant what the president of the United States' view on same-sex marriages, because there's never going to be a bill that came to his desk to sign or veto. So some of it was there was not real policy consequences. It's not like asking Biden, would you sign an infrastructure bill that's only $2 trillion or something, right? Where we care about his opinion. What it did do was it convinced the White House that this was totally safe. And that leads to them sending the Solicitor General before the Supreme Court of the United States to argue that it is now the view of the U.S. government, of the Justice Department, that state bans on gay marriage are unconstitutional. And there is real reason to believe that carries weight with the justices of the Supreme Court and we saw evidence of this under Truman and Eisenhower in the Civil Rights Movement, that when the federal government says that we stand with plaintiffs who are challenging civil rights laws, that has some weight. And so that's a place where you really see the consequence of it, is that they thought that there was no political cost to being seen as having gone too far on this issue. And that was definitely the calculations, a couple of years earlier.
So I have another question from virtual, and then I will come over to you or someone else. If the Hawaii case had not happened as it did in 1993, would we have marriage equality in all 50 states today?
I would guess no. I think that at some point there might have been somebody who would have sued and gotten lucky and found a judiciary that was sympathetic to this. But the subsequent cases, there's a lawsuit in Vermont that ends up victorious but leads to civil unions. Then the suit in Massachusetts, which is successful in 2003. Each of those build on the sort of lessons of the previous lawsuits, both political lessons, legal lessons. courts are emboldened by precedent, not just the actual precedent that you cite in an opinion, but courts are emboldened by seeing that other judges have already done this and, didn't get their head chopped off in the public square or something, right? And so it is the sequence of events that takes place in other states was galvanized by what happened in Hawaii and sort of made this a national issue. And it's, I don't know if we might be on some path towards this, but no, we would not be where we are today without that at all.
Oh, thanks. Sasha, this is so interesting. Thank you.
Jane.
Can you talk about the composition of the court and where we are?
Current composition.
Composition of the court and the fact that things feel in flux. Is this decision one of those that you worry about for the future?
So the narrow answer is no. So we're 50 years after Roe v. Wade, right? So just and what happened after Roe in 73 was there was some effort among anti-abortion activists, pro-life activists to amend the U.S. Constitution to ban abortion or define life, a fetus as having basically equal protection, due process rights. It was clear by 1980 that even with Reagan in the White House and whatever else, that was not going to, you're not going to amend the U.S. Constitution. And then you had this real push to get the court to, undermine core tenets of Roe with the goal of getting them to reverse the central holding of Roe. And it's possible that we're likely to see this issue come up before the Supreme Court this year. Who knows if they engage with that objective, but that's been a legal strategy for 30, 40 years now on the right. I have seen no evidence in the 6 years since Obergefell that there is anybody who is talking, who states a goal of reversing Obergefell. And I do not see any evidence of trying to lay the building blocks to get the court incrementally to go back and revisit the core holding, which is that the fundamental right to marriage in the Constitution extends to same-sex couples, and that states cannot ban it. And so it's really unusual for the court to revisit its precedents on anything, and I see no reason to think that this is going to be something that they go back to. What I do think we're in the beginning period of a lot of these religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions, and if you want to, this is a court which is going to be favorably disposed to those. They ruled on the Bakery case and the foster parent case rather narrowly, but there's no reason to think that there won't be 5 votes for, a broader sort of recognition of religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions. And I think if you want a kind of idea of like, if you don't want to sleep tonight and you want a worst case scenario, it would be something along the lines of a case where a company says our owners or shareholders or board have a set of religious values that do not recognize same-sex couples, and thus we will give parental leave and health insurance to our employees who are in opposite-sex marriages, but we will not recognize our employees who are in same-sex marriages as married and give their spouses benefits or whatever else. And Hobby Lobby was basically a version of that for contraception, and you could imagine that being the kind of pushing a carve out to the point where the underlying question is not, there's no question that gays and lesbians can marry in 50 states. The question is, how much leeway do private actors have to treat different types of marriages differently based on a private actor's values? And that could be the place where, 2 men, 2 women can say I'm married, and then there are a lot of private institutions that can say, well, that doesn't mean a lot to me. I'm not going to treat you as married if I don't see your marriage. And so that's, I think, where we could head.
We're going to
I
ask
think we have one more question.
one more question.
I actually, first of all, I can't wait to read the book because I'm
Thank you,
really
Steve.
interested to find out about all this stuff. But what you're raising is a question that I thought of the whole time you were talking about this, which is, as this was happening, was there a question being raised that allowing same-sex marriage to be legal wasn't going to be enough to actually protect enough LGBT rights? And that in fact, I mean, if you want to think that Newt Gingrich is this smart, that this whole idea was created at the beginning in the 90s as part of his little game so that we could fight over it for 20 or 30 years, then pass it, but not have it actually change all the other Supreme Court cases having to do with the protection of LGBT rights, that it's pretty narrow in terms of how it protects these rights.
Yeah. So I should disclose I love Newt Gingrich fanfic as much as the next guy, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, because it was before the Supreme Court in 2015 how broad or narrow this decision would be. And one of the things that I talked about how sort of foreordained the outcome before the court was. And so for the people who knew that they were going to lose, they all of a sudden pivoted to trans stuff and these religious liberty. To the people who knew that they were going to win, the gay rights litigators, they started trying to lay the foundation for this to be a big victory. And a big victory for them, and this was not just Mary Bonato, who was the lawyer who argued successfully the Massachusetts case, and then the first Big Doma challenge, and then argued Obergefell before the Supreme Court. Not just her arguments, but in this case, the Justice Department, Obama's Justice Department, which stood before the court, and they said basically there's sort of two ways to think about why the discrimination in marriage was a constitutional problem before the court. And you could either say it's because marriage is a fundamental right, and if you get in the way of people using a fundamental right, then the court can't let that discrimination stand or has to impose a really high standard to justify it. And that's why interfering with voting rights, for example, is something for which the courts have little patience. Or you could say it's because it discriminates against a group of people who should be protected under civil rights law. And courts, both by statute and by case law, recognize race and religion and gender or sex as for example, as categories on which discrimination cannot be justified. And so the question before the Supreme Court is, do we treat this as a marriage case or do we treat this as a gay rights case? Is the problem with this because you're getting in the way of people marrying, or is this because you picked on people because they're sexual minorities? And Anthony Kennedy, the liberal justices, wanted to make this a gay rights case. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg had written the majority opinion, it would have been written as this is a gay rights case. This is about, and said, we're going to treat sexual orientation and maybe also gender identity the same way we treat race, which is you cannot use it as a category to discriminate against people effectively. And what that would have done, that would have been a big victory. That would have struck down that would have forced all those states eventually that allow you to discriminate on the basis of to fire somebody because they're gay, not to be able to do that anymore, for example. It would have created a foundation for challenges to a whole lot of laws that can be perceived as treating gays, lesbians, bisexuals, maybe transgendered people differently. But Anthony Kennedy wrote this, this was the fourth major gay rights opinion. He will be seen as the great gay rights justice in Supreme Court history, but he wrote this very narrowly. And so it's a remarkable opinion in that, I have a coffee mug that has quotes from his opinion written on it because it's inspiring and moving. And you could go on Etsy right now and buy all sorts of, fairly dismal looking merchandise that has quotes from this, which is unusual for legal opinions. But it ultimately, so it was broad in its sort of emotional resonance, but narrow in its legal impact. And ultimately that legal impact did nothing besides strike down bans on same-sex marriage. And so up until 2015, you were one justice away from a more sweeping decision that would have made it potentially made it impossible for, let's say, Donald Trump to ban transgender people from serving in the military, right? Or people to ban access to a sports team on the basis of gender identity, and the court chose not to go there just 6 years ago.
Wow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxanne.
I do have one other question. Can I ask him one other question? Do you guys mind? Okay. So you have, I didn't wait for an answer. I'm just jumping in. There are, I don't know, dozens of characters in this book. Who's your favorite?
My favorite is this guy, Bill Woods, who is one of the few or only main characters I never met, who's this activist in Hawaii, and I'll try to do this as briefly as possible. He was the gay activist in Hawaii in the 70s or 80s. You know, the closest thing you could think of is like the Mark Siegel of Honolulu. Incredibly entrepreneurial. He started the gay newspaper there, the Gay Community Center, had the first gay radio show. And this is where he differs from Mark, like, you know, not particularly good working in alliance or coalition with other people. Very good about starting things and getting attention, not particularly good about the teamwork part of politics. And he ends up in this really petty rivalry for control of a pride planning committee in Honolulu in 1989. His rivals are these two lesbian women who've started a magazine that competes with his gay newspaper for advertising, and what you can only imagine is the big pool of advertisers who want to be in LGBT publications in Hawaii in 1989. They want to have a picnic and vigil for as the sort of Central Pride commemoration, which has been the sort of standard thing. He wants to have a parade. Honolulu had one parade in 1974 in Waikiki. They didn't do another one. It's hard to put on a parade, whatever. He agitates for a parade. They say, okay, you can have and I apologize, like if any of you are involved in like event planning committees for anything, like office birthdays or something, you're gonna get PTSD at this. They say you can have a subcommittee to explore the possibility of the parade. He calls a bunch of mainland pride organizations to get information on how you put together a gay pride parade. He comes back, he lays out his view of a parade. They say, no, we're still not going to do the parade. So he leaves and starts his own pride parade and rally council. And so now he's going to put on his parade, but he also is looking for every other way to possibly upstage these two lesbian women in their committee who are putting on this picnic and vigil. So he invites the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band to perform. He gets a friend of his who's a chef and caterer to put on an international food festival. He asks the governor to be the grand marshal. And he decides at the rally at the end of this parade, they're going to have a Mooney-style mass wedding with maybe a couple dozen couples who would exchange these holy union vows at the Metropolitan Community Church, you know, and which nobody had done with any expectation that this had legal force. They were just sort of, you know, symbolic commitment ceremonies. Bill Woods was not a lawyer. He very clearly misread the state marriage family law statute, came away with the misguided impression that it was possible that because there were some places in the Hawaii Code that did not specify that marriage applied to only one man and only one woman, that if these couples exchanged vows, that the state might have to recognize them as married. He went to the state affiliate of the ACLU to ask them to back him up if this became a legal issue. The ACLU said no, probably because they actually did have real lawyers, and also because they did not want to be caught up in one of like Bill Woods's like cockamamie, you know, undertakings. And so the sort of part of the opening of the book is this early 1990. They just sort of push him aside. We need to check with the head office in New York for an opinion on this. And they say, well, now we have to go check with all these gay and lesbian law professors about precedents on marriage. And it's so clear that they're just trying to delay this past June of 1990 so that he has his parade and doesn't do the wedding thing, just moves on to whatever his next project is going to be. And June comes and goes. There isn't the wedding. He has the parade. But now he's really upset that the ACLU is disrespecting and humiliating him. And so December 17th, 1990 rolls around and he puts out a press release and says, I'm going to bring couples into the public health department office to request marriage licenses. And there's these 3 couples. They walk in, they request marriage licenses, like the entirety of the Honolulu press corps trails them. And his idea is that they'll request marriage licenses. They'll probably get turned down initially, but he'll march the couples to the ACLU office with TV cameras and newspaper reporters behind them, and he'll jam the ACLU because there's no way that this group that says that they're committed to gay rights could possibly turn away these couples with all this media attention. And they get turned down. The attorney general later says that the health director was right not to let them marry under state law. They go to the ACLU. ACLU still wants nothing to do with him. They get handed to a local civil rights attorney the next month in Honolulu. He sues the state in May of 1991, and that leads to that, the first time that a court recognizes that the fundamental right to marriage in the state constitution could extend to same-sex couples. And so he's a catalyst for all of this, and he is great because
a wackadoodle.
And he has no plan and is acting by instinct and pettiness, and is tactically kind of clever, but does not have a strategy in any of this. And it is such a different story than, I was shaped reading all these books about the civil rights movement where you see Thurgood Marshall and Nathan Margold planning for 40 years about how they're going to bring Brown v. Board to the Supreme Court, and everything's so deliberate and everything's so strategized. And I started this project assuming there had to be somebody like that at the beginning of the gay marriage story. And it's like, no, it's Bill Woods, and he's in a petty fight because the lesbians wanted to have a picnic and he wanted to have a parade.
Amazing.
And 25 years later, the Supreme Court does what the Supreme Court did. So
that's incredible. So thank you very much for sharing all that with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Rox. Thanks to the Citizen.